What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for 7, The Days Long Gone, a game from 2017 that blends together, I would say, a variety of genres to make something pretty unique, but probably a little more ambitious than the studio's developer, Fool's Theory, had the resources for. Though when everything is working, it's a great experience, and we're going to get into that over the course of this review, but to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. For more information, my Steam profile is public and linked below, alongside a video that explains everything that I go over. Though in that regard, 7 is a very easy game to 100%, really only requires one playthrough if you follow a guide for one of the endings, which requires a few specific choices, but otherwise very easy to do in like 20 to 30 hours. So with that said, let's dive into it. Now, as always, I like to kick things off with a section discussing the technical state of the game, and while I don't typically go as hard into that for older games, I think it's very important for 7 in particular, because this is a game I had intended to review quite some time ago, as I had received many recommendations on covering it. However, I was unable to do so because for quite some time, I loaded up the game, I could play for about a minute, and then it would crash, and a bit of research showed me that this was a very prominent problem the game had, and while it was playable for some people, this was a big issue. Just a couple of months ago, however, the game received an update that focused on fixing that specific issue, and 6 years after it released, I think is pretty noteworthy. While that made the game playable for me, finally, it still does have a variety of other issues. Now, by far the biggest is that it's not incredibly stable. Over the course of about 24 hours that I spent with this game, it crashed on me probably half a dozen times. Most of the time it did it right on launch, like I'd fire it up and it would immediately crash back to the desktop, and one or two other times when I was saving the game. Now, curiously enough, the game did actually register that save and I was able to start immediately from where I had saved, but sometimes that crashed the title. Now, while I would say that's the biggest issue, there are a few minor ones as well, mostly to do with controls and terrain. More than once I got stuck inside objects and things like that as I would move around, so it certainly to this day has a few issues that are noteworthy, though nothing that's really going to stop you from completing the game. Just some stuff that gets kind of annoying. Now, with that said, let's dive into the story setup for this title. 7, The Days Long Gone takes place in a post-apocalyptic world of sorts, where a conflict between humans and demons as they're known, though these are effectively like AI specters of sorts, led to humanity's downfall. The remnants of civilization managed to rise up in the ashes of all this age-old technology under the banner of a man named Drugan, who is now the emperor of the Vetral Empire. Drugan, having discovered some of the secrets to the ancients as they're called, that is to say ancient human civilization, managed to restore technology to a point that it could be useful to broader civilization. He's used that power to, of course, cement his empire, but also trying to further his larger goal of bringing humanity to the stars. We, however, play a master thief known as Teriel. Early on in the game, Teriel undertakes a job that, of course, rather swiftly goes wrong. This puts us in contact with a demon who then goes on to possess us, which is how they can reach their full potential. After we wake up from this event, we find ourselves on an Imperial Zeppelin headed to the prison island of Pei. Our newly acquired demon explains that he effectively possessed our body after finding the artifact we were after triggered the bonding process. And it turns out this wasn't random chance, but rather a test put forth by Emperor Drugan himself. A test we apparently passed by not dying. So in order to escape this situation, we need to find someone for Drugan on this prison island, and doing so might just determine the fate of the entire Vetral Empire. Now that's as much as I want to go into without spoilers. That's basically just like the first 30 minutes of the game, but there are a few general notes I want to make. For starters, I enjoyed the story quite a bit. It takes a little while to get going as you spend much of the early game just chasing after one specific person, but towards the end I was very invested and I wanted to see how it ended and what happened or became of myself in this world afterwards. With that in mind, there are 4 different endings to the game, but 3 of them are always available to you. The 4th one is an extra option you also have at the ending if you made a few specific decisions throughout some of the quests and found a few specific notes. However, while that one is generally regarded as the true or best ending, I will say that all of the endings are shades of gray. I wouldn't really consider any one of them better than the others, outside of one that's pretty clearly the bad ending. In fact, in my personal opinion, one of the default endings was probably the best overall. But I tell you all that to inform you that there is a tiny bit of choice and consequence to this game. Not a terribly large amount, but several quests and, of course, the larger game does have a variety of endings or ways things can play out, which was nice. I wasn't really expecting it, but it was cool to see. Moving right along from there, however, let's talk progression systems. Now, this is where the game gets a little curious. Now, we obviously play a set character with a set look. However, the direction in which we shape Teriel can certainly go a few different directions, which comes down to skills, gear, and crafting. Now, there is a little bit of, I would say, non-character progression via things like the visa system, but we'll get into that in the gameplay and world section. Now, the biggest thing to know by far is the skills. And honestly, this is a system that the game itself does not do a great job of explaining, and it took me quite some time to fully figure out. It's not particularly complicated, mind you, the game just doesn't really explain any of it very well. So when it comes to your skills, these are divided up into your main skill chip, your active abilities, your passive abilities, and then your upgrades. As you explore the prison island of Pei, you're going to find skill chips. Most of these are of the upgrade variety, and you can't do anything with them right away. However, as you go through quests and complete main quests, you'll unlock more and more skill chips. Your skill chips can be thought of as sort of individual potential loadouts, though they are not all made equal. These chips will determine some base passive and bonuses you get, while also determining the amount of active and passive slots available to you, and thus what you can upgrade. Some of them are outright better than others, but towards the end of the game, these will determine multiple different play styles and the loadout you have when that chip is equipped. So if you wanted to swap between two different play styles and you had them set up, you could just equip one of these versus the other. Now, once that is done, you have access to a few active abilities, which are effectively like magic, and passives. Most of the abilities come from completing either main quests or the DLC, which was a free expansion we'll get to, and then your passives usually come from side quest chains, but can also be gotten through the main quest as well. Now, your active abilities are just that, your active abilities. These are things like a blink ability that you get by default, a time slow ability, an invisibility power, which in my opinion was the best, alongside a few others. There's not a ton of these, but they give you enough to play around with. Now, your passives are just that. They are passive abilities that grant you individual little bonuses to a certain playstyle like fighter or assassin, for instance. Both your actives and your passives can be upgraded with skill chips. These are usually what you find around in chests throughout the island. These are for the most part specific to individual passives and skills, but there are some that are universal, like simply upgrading the cost and energy, etc. Now, the other part of this system, though, and what allows you to slot more and more of these upgrades and actives and passives in, is your nectar. Nectar is a substance that allows humans to improve their natural attributes in some way. Basically, the stuff that allows you to insert these chips. Every active and passive you install costs 2 nectar from your total, whereas every little upgrade to those things then costs 1. So in order to upgrade your skills, you have to, of course, have the skill, have the chips, acquire the nectar to then upgrade them further. It's not terribly complicated, or at least not as complicated as it might initially sound, but the game just does a very poor job of explaining all this to you. Now, another portion of progression is our gear, of course. This is a little more basic, as some of this stuff is simply better than others, but you will have a bunch of armor and weapon slots that all, of course, have their own individual stats, such as blocking certain types of damage, determining how you attack via your weapons, and I would say mostly pretty obvious stuff. But nonetheless, a few things of note here. Weapon-wise, you're looking at a few different types of weapons, though generally divided into melee and ranged. Melee has things like swords, maces, some dual-wield options, and they can all, of course, be augmented by various status effects like causing more bleed to the target, poisoning them, burning them, shocking them, etc. Ranged weapons, on the other hand, don't take ammo, but rather cost energy to use. It will regen passively pretty quickly, but it does limit you from just completely sniping things and not having to engage in any combat at all. You can also equip a variety of different items in your equipment screen, which is important because this is how you're going to do things like heal in combat, or perhaps toss a grenade, set some traps up, and just generally set up the battlefield before you get there, or perhaps use things on the fly. But probably the biggest thing to know about your gear is the disguise system that works okay. Basically, if you have a full set of a certain type of gear, You can, of course, constitute a disguise with it, though its usefulness is a little varied. You see, while in a disguise, you don't just automatically pass as one of those guards, but if you get close enough to them, you'll still trigger suspicion in some way. Now, the upside to this is when you are in private places, it makes you a little harder to detect, and you can run around a little bit more freely, though it still does have some ramifications. The downside to this system is if you are wearing a disguise in an area that is not, in fact, a private space, you might actually trigger a response from those people who still get suspicious despite the fact that you should be able to roam around this area freely, which is where the disguises feel not so great. So in order to make use of disguises, you have to take them on and off and swap out your equipment all the time, and there's no quick way to do this. It's all done through menus one item at a time, which can be a little bit annoying, which is why generally I found it best to just not use the disguises, but situationally they can be pretty useful. Now, a much bigger part of progression though is the crafting system, and while you can do the usual stuff with this, like crafting upgrades for your armor and weapons, making your consumable items, things like that, the reason I consider crafting progression is because this is how you're going to upgrade your lockpicks and your drill. As a master thief, we have access to things like the ability to lockpick or just bypass locks altogether with a multi-tool, but higher tiers of locks require higher tiers of these materials, which requires you to upgrade them via crafting via a one-time upgrade. Again, another thing the game does not explain super well, as it just refers to a general lockpick or drill level, and you might at first be confused into thinking that this has something to do with the skill chip system, where it's possible to upgrade your efficiency at doing these things. But what you actually need to do is find a crafting station, upgrade it to either tier 2 or 3, and then, if you have the schematic, finally be able to upgrade your lockpick or your drill. This is actually a pretty big deal because those upgrades are sometimes required to get into areas that allow you to then go on to unlock fast travel points, so it's a substantial portion of progression. Now the issue here is that upgrading both the crafting station and actually then upgrading your items takes a substantial amount of crafting resources, and if you're just trying to scrounge that stuff, it takes forever. But once you know how to do it and when you need to do it, all you've got to do is go to a vendor, buy a bunch of junk, dismantle it into the parts you need, and then you can get these upgrades pretty quickly. But it's unlikely you'll have those resources just laying around ever, especially because of the item and weight limit. Teriel has a pretty restrictive weight limit that is not very high at all. You can only really carry around so much equipment, and while you do have a stash back at your base, and you can upgrade your weight limit a tiny bit via your chips, it's impossible to ever get it to a, I would say, really high level that allows you to carry around a lot of stuff. And because you're doing things like carrying around a bunch of crafting components, a variety of consumables to use in combat, potentially multiple disguises, it gets very tedious very quickly to deal with this inventory system, and in a world where you're surrounded by magic and the like, it seems like a really weird place to draw the line, as it serves mostly to just get in the way. But with all of that said, let's dive into the gameplay and world section of this video. Now, the world of 7 is one of the most remarkable things about it, because it's a sort of open sandbox that if you know what you're doing, you can explore pretty freely. There's a couple of areas that are gated off by things like skills and upgrades, as I briefly alluded to, but otherwise you're largely free to go pretty much anywhere immediately. Now the catch to this is, some areas you need a specific visa to get into, as you are technically a prisoner on this island, lest you forget. Prisoners are granted more and more privileges by their visa. You start with a level 1 visa, and certain areas of the island are supposed to only be navigated by people with more. You can pay for these visas, or if you knock someone out, you can potentially clone theirs, giving you access to these other portions of the island without being attacked. Now you can generally still get into these other areas, outside of a few barriers that the game just won't let you cross, but you can go around them generally. The issue being that if guards and things see you in areas where you're not supposed to be, you will be attacked, making your life a little bit harder. But generally, these visas are pretty easy to acquire outside of the very last one, which requires you to finish a bunch of quests, but you never actually have to go to that area of the map anyway, so it is what it is. Now, beyond just this open sandbox of an island full of a variety of cities and things we'll get to, a lot of the map can be divided into either public or private areas. Most of the island, as you might imagine, is a public space, but a few areas are designated as private. These are where you'll be attacked on sight, more or less, and ideally need to either be sneaking or wearing a disguise to move through. And this is where the game's stealth mechanics and sound come into play. Now, as you might imagine, you can simply crouch down and sneak to get through places, which will allow you to do things like hide in certain things like bushes, large piles of hay, leaves, paper, whatever else you might find, and sneak around enemies who aren't looking at you, of course. Now, this is going to allow you to do things like sneak up to enemies and backstab them, which if you don't have upgraded enough weapons might not necessarily kill them in one shot. But combined with abilities like the invisibility, it's pretty easy to freely move in and out of these areas as long as you don't get seen too much. The other aspect to this, though, is sound. Sometimes enemies will hear you doing something, which will cause them to investigate. This is where your lockpicking versus drilling comes in. Lockpicking is silent, but it takes longer. Drilling is immediate, but makes noise, and guards will come to investigate. And once you start in on combat with one particular guard, if that happens, you'll make a bunch more noise, drawing in even more guards, which can lead to you quickly being overwhelmed and killed. Though the other big aspect to this is the level design and finding interesting ways around. We have a lot of different methods of traversal, with us being able to scale a lot of walls, jump on most objects, and basically if it looks like you could climb it, you probably can. You can go through windows, you can peek through them to see what's on the other side before you jump through and immediately get caught, for instance, alongside just finding unique ways in, like the ability to zip line down certain things, which can let you bypass entire areas that might otherwise prove difficult. And that's to say nothing of using your abilities creatively, like for instance the DLC gives you one called Doppelganger, which lets you swap appearances with a guard, for instance, which opens up some interesting gameplay options, and there's a variety of things like that. And it's definitely where the game shines the most. Here's your goal, and however you reach it is largely up to you, as they've given you a bunch of tools and fun things to experiment with as you try to do that. Now, the flip side to this is that the level design and how easy it is to get overwhelmed and die or just fall off of things becomes apparent pretty quickly. Now, on one side, the entire island, including both the lived areas, the cities, and their surrounding portions, which have a surprising degree of verticality to them, that lets you traverse and move pretty freely, also leads to you dying very quickly. It's pretty easy to fall off of stuff and die. It's easy to get pushed off of things and die. It's easy to get overwhelmed and very quickly killed. And while the game definitely supports, I would say, quick saving and quick loading and then making a lot of manual saves, this bumps up against a weird problem that the game only lets you keep 20 manual saves, which is a weird restriction for a game that actively encourages you to save scum as much as possible. Otherwise, you're going to have to risk playing certain sections of the game over and over again. And it's just kind of a perfect example of the way this game's systems can sometimes be at odds with the way the game is actively telling you to play it, which is a similar case for the fast travel of the title. Now, in order to fast travel, you first have to go to what they call the Overseer, basically a computer system that controls the various fast travel points, which is actually like a train system. And to access each individual line, you have to access the Overseer first. But in order to get to the Overseer, you might have to do things like upgrade your lock or your drill to then unlock fast travel points in areas you've already been exploring. I would say multiple times while I was playing this game, it took me quite some time to unlock fast travel points for places I had already been thoroughly exploring, due to either not having the required upgrades to get into certain areas, though sometimes you can bypass those simply by pickpocketing a key off a guard, but there are a few times where that's not available, or the Overseer that you need might be in a location that simply isn't accessible to you despite it being a relatively early area, but then the Overseer for some reason will be in a higher level area, let's say, which can make exploring sometimes just a little bit awkward. And while a lot of what I just went over is the mechanical ins and outs of the world, I don't want to, I would say, undersell the atmosphere of this particular world. I really enjoyed what they did here in showcasing the sort of remnants of an ancient civilization with people using all sorts of really advanced technology that a lot of people don't really understand and generally equate to magic. It's also interesting because while it is, in some cases, a fully functioning society with people living more or less normal lives, you have to remember that it is in fact a prison island being guarded by primarily two factions, the Biomancers and the Techno-Magi, who each have their own goals and are embroiled in the happenings of the Vetral Empire, with the Techno-Magi being just basically all about using as much technology as possible, whereas the biomancers, while also using a fair bit of technology, do so in the, I would say, furtherance of altering physical forms. They make all sorts of weird fleshy creations and are often called leeches by other people, as they seek to merge flesh and technology into one greater thing, which are pretty interesting factions. There are other minor factions as well that you'll encounter, but the methods with which both of these factions are trying to exert dominance over the prisoners and the resources of the island are interesting to see, because what these factions are guarding and what the prisoners are doing here, which is effectively working to uncover technology of the past and a substance known as aurite. And the fruits of all this labor is then gathered up and shipped back to the Vetral Empire. This is where the tram system comes in that ships all these goods back and forth, and it makes for a really interesting setting that is further explored, of course, by all sorts of side quests that give a glimpse into how life is lived here, some of which is pretty fascinating. Now, another aspect to all of this, though, is sense mode. Our character, Teriel, has a mechanical eye, and one thing this allows him to do is enter sense mode to see things that might escape normal human perception. This allows you to make discoveries or highlight specific quest objects, and 9 out of 10, if you're just wandering around and you can't seem to sort out an objective of some kind, usually the answer is sense mode. Sometimes quest objects, things like that, cannot be interacted with until they are highlighted in this mode, which sometimes felt a little unnecessary, because usually the quest object is pretty apparent, like this is the thing I'm looking for, but you then have to go into sense mode, trigger it, and then you can use it, which can feel a bit unintuitive at times. Now, another way this game fleshes out its atmosphere is with its DLC, The Drowned Past. Now, with the Enhanced Edition, this is just rolled into the base game, you don't need to do anything extra, but towards the, I would say, later parts of the main story, we get a visitor at our base who is a person from our past. We can help this person and their little ragtag group of misfits explore an underwater ship that they found that looks a lot like, I would say, Rapture from BioShock, to be honest, though there are supposed to be riches held within that you would like to get to. This quest offers new abilities, new items, basically the usual stuff you would get from an expansion, and it itself has a few different endings, though nothing that I would say changes the game fundamentally or anything. Overall, in terms of the gameplay and world, though, the thing I want to get across here is that it's a really interesting blend of a lot of different systems that sometimes come together to make this really enthralling experience where you're caught up in the lore and the how and the whys of everything. And then there are other times where you're exploring and you keep encountering just very annoying little quirks of this game and this hodgepodge of systems that makes it feel like it wasn't really thought out super well, such as the wait system, the awkwardness of the save system. Why do I have to go to late game areas to unlock fast travel points for the early game? Which means exploring and playing this game often oscillates between having a really good time to being frustrated about why certain design decisions were made. But that said, let's talk about combat. Combat in this game is a weird one, because I think when you are in active combat, fighting off multiple enemies at a time, it's okay at best. However, a lot of what you can do to take out enemies in stealth and set up the battlefield before combat even starts, such as, of course, backstabbing people, setting up traps, throwing grenades, using your abilities, all of that stuff feels really great. But when you're actively engaged in combat fighting off enemies, it mostly just becomes a hack and slash that isn't particularly engaging, and if anything highlights how finicky the controls can be, because if your character gets knocked down or something by an enemy, sometimes this resets the direction that you think you're facing, and then when you go to dodge or something, your character goes in the completely wrong direction, which got very annoying. Though, with enough gear, etc., you can absolutely just take enemies head on, like there's no reason to go into stealth all the time if you don't want to. In fact, the, I would say, consequence for being caught is very minimal, as you can pass time in sense mode, so if you, say, get caught and you need to run away from a bunch of enemies, you can do that, find a hiding place, go into sense mode, fast forward time until the enemy just completely forgets about you and resets, basically. So you can partake in or avoid most of the more action-oriented combat. However, there are a few places where it's mandatory. Every once in a while, you're going to be thrown into a boss fight, potentially unexpectedly, that you may or may not have prepared for, at which point point, you're forced to fight for your life, as it were. And this is where things like knowing how best to apply things like consumables, grenades, etc. are going to help you out the most. And it's why it's important you don't neglect upgrading your weapons, despite mostly being able to play it through as a stealth title. Overall, in terms of combat, it's, again, I would say mostly just okay. It certainly didn't wow me. There are parts of it I think feel incredibly clunky, and you can even avoid a great deal of it. But there are also parts of it I really enjoyed, like setting things up, luring a bunch of enemies into traps, knocking them off ledges, playing around with the abilities, but for the most part, I would just consider it okay. Definitely important to mention, however, that you do have to keep an eye on your energy meter. This is the blue bar to the right of your health bar, of course, as this is what determines your ability to use things like your active abilities and most ranged weapons, which rely off of energy to shoot. It also allows you to use your special attacks for your melee weapons. So managing that resource can be a big part of combat, and it often tends to serve as a limiting factor due to your ranged weapons' reliance on it. So it can often be difficult to just completely avoid enemies altogether by staying back and using ranged, because you ultimately bump up against that limit. Now, you can adjust this to recharge pretty quickly, and you can use items to recharge it as well, so it's not necessarily an invalid way to play the game or anything. It's just something to keep in mind. Now, some of the checkpoints around the island where you would normally go through for your visas will actually have a field around them that completely drains your energy altogether, which makes those places harder to sneak in and deal with enemies because you don't have access to your energy and thus your abilities. That, however, brings us to our Steam Deck section. Now, this is an interesting one as far as the Steam Deck goes, because officially it has a rating of unsupported, but I have a feeling that that rating is old. That is to say, it doesn't take into account the recent patch that seems to fix things, because while I wasn't able to record any footage, because whenever I tried to record this on the Steam Deck it freaked out and crashed, I was able to actually play it, and it does have full cloud save support, it has full controller support, and I was able to play a significant portion of this game on the Steam Deck with zero issues. Some of the text can certainly be a little small, so if I had to guess, it probably deserves a rating of playable, because outside of a little bit of stuttering in the more densely populated areas of the world, it ran pretty great on that platform. So again, I would simply guess that the rating for this one is on the older side from before it got its recent patches. But with that, let's talk positives, negatives, and then wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, this game has an interesting story with multiple outcomes. It has a very ambitious open world sandbox that you can really approach in a variety of different ways with different play styles, with a lot of layered systems that really allow you to dig into that and potentially be really immersed by it. There were definitely moments that, despite this game's relatively short runtime, I had a really hard time putting it down because I was enjoying it so much. And as we'll get to with the negatives here in just a second, I wouldn't say it's any real one thing to point at and be like, this is the best part. It's just that a lot of these systems come together in a really enjoyable way when everything is working. But on the flip side of that, with the negative things, it's mostly a combination of just questionable design decisions that make me feel like the studio behind it just lacked resources to really see a lot of this through. For instance, we have the weird situation with the limit on manual saves for a game that actively encourages you to save scum. We have clunky controls, clunky fast travel, clunky disguise system, etc. And you can definitely find yourself butting up against the sides of those systems where they're just not quite working in a way that you feel they should, or in a way that makes a lot of sense, like the annoying weight limit, for instance. So I would say for the most part, on the negative side, it's just a lot of general janky systems that can occasionally combine in a unique way while you're trying to do something that makes just for a mess. Which brings me to my conclusion. 7 The Days Long Gone is a really interesting title. In many ways, I think it is ambitious and clearly made with a lot of attention to detail that can leave you enthralled at times. I was genuinely having such a great time for a lot of the playtime that I have with this game. But that is juxtaposed against the, again, just general jankiness and occasionally design decisions that just make me go, why would you do that? So all in all, I would say 7 is a unique experience that I mostly enjoyed. It combines a lot of systems and genres to make something a bit unlike anything I've ever played before, and many times I think that paid off, but can also occasionally just make you want to rage quit. though I would say the passion of the developer clearly shines through in this regard. Now, when it comes to actually recommending the game, though, it is generally $30 US full price, and of course, whatever that is for your region, but you can, due to its age, regularly find it on sale. It is part of the Steam Winter Sale right now at the time of this review, and it is literally $3 until January the 4th, as an example. So you can regularly find it on a deep discount, and for that price, it is absolutely worth it. For me personally, though, I would have gladly paid full price for this, as it was certainly a very memorable experience. That, though, is going to do it for me and this review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it informative. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. I review older games like this alongside all sorts of new releases, so hopefully you'll find something that you enjoy. Regardless of any of that, though, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.